So this video is what the title says. Today we're going to be looking at 5 homebrew rules that I use in my Dungeons & Dragons games. Hi everyone, my name is John from DM Shower Thoughts, where we find our best selves through gaming. If you watched my last video, then you know that when I adjudicate my 5th edition D&D games, I tend to prefer to use the rules as written. So, before getting to this list, I'd like to frame this conversation by talking about the function of homebrew in a 5th edition game. You see, I find that some DMs only include homebrew as a way to set their table apart from other tables. You see, this can cause confusion with a lot of players and actually be detrimental to their experience. I found that the successful implementation of homebrew comes from one of 3 places. First, and most common, a homebrew rule is included just because it makes the game more fun. Second, a homebrew rule may remove some kind of hassle on the DM or the player's part, which improves the game's quality of life. And third, a homebrew rule may be included because it helps the DM and the players immerse themselves in the collective game world. And obviously, you can probably think of some homebrew rules that address more than one of these concerns at a time. As I move through this list, I'm going to be tagging each of the homebrew rules accordingly so that you know why I include them in my game. One other thing before I get started, you'll notice that when I include homebrew in my game, I very rarely remove or revise mechanics that are written in the core rulebooks. Instead, what I do is I usually add qualities or clarification to rules that already exist. I found that by using homebrew in this way, it minimizes the amount of unintended consequences from different rules interacting. And with that out of the way, let's begin the countdown. Homebrew rule number 1 is simple, and a lot of people don't realize that it's homebrew. This homebrew rule is natural 1s and natural 20s. The rule is really easy to describe. First, if you roll a 20 on the d20, then that means whatever you do automatically succeeds. Likewise, if you roll a natural 1, that means that you automatically fail. The implementation of this rule is fairly universal, and it does feel kind of silly that I have to include it on this list. And it has huge implications on how this game is played. Like I said, if you watch the rules as written video, natural 20s and natural 1s really only appear in the player's handbook under combat when you make an attack roll. Really what this rule is doing is applying that same mindset to any kind of d20 roll in the game. And that includes ability checks, saving throws, and attack rolls. Now, I find that this rule is just so iconic that it's almost hard to play like a true D&D experience without it. The real kind of meat and potatoes of this rule to mention is how natural 1s function. Because natural 1s are an automatic failure, what I make sure to do as a DM is let the player have the freedom to describe why their character would fail with a natural 1. This way, the player is in control of the tone of their character. It's always kind of irked me at a table where a player is trying to play kind of a serious character, and just because of luck of the dice, the dungeon master almost makes fun of them by making them some kind of star of a slapstick comedy. And so to avoid any kind of tension like that, it's now in the player's realm if they would like to show their character a little bit of humility by putting in a little bit of comedy, or if they want to just kind of be like, nope, I just rolled a nat 1 and I just failed on to the next thing. And natural 1s are going to nicely segue into homebrew rule number 2. Homebrew rule number 2 has everything to do with opportunity attacks. Ironically, I find opportunity attacks a missed opportunity in 5th edition. Normally, a creature provokes an opportunity attack when it uses its movement to move out of another creature's range without taking the disengage action. In the game's core rules, there are lots of times when opportunity attacks are referenced, such as with the Sentinel feat. And I feel that's something that iconic to the game should be referenced more often, and the way that you do that is by finding additional things that provoke opportunity attacks. So, first addition is that a creature provokes an opportunity attack in my game if they use their movement to stand from the prone position. As a martial artist and someone who teaches fighting for a living, I can definitely say with my experience, it's more likely in real life that someone would get an opportunity attack from standing up rather than just kind of moving out of another creature's effective range. Second, if a creature attempts an opportunity attack against a target, and they roll a nat 1, they provoke opportunity attacks from that target. It makes melee characters think twice about their positioning and can really add a lot of dynamic interaction to combat. And speaking of positioning, Homebrew rule number 3 is both the implementation of and an addition to the flanking rule found in the Dungeon Master's Guide. While many DMs try to rebalance the flanking mechanic found in the Dungeon Master's Guide by swapping out advantage with a conditional modifier, I've always just found it much easier to adjudicate and much more fun at my table to just grant my players advantage. It's a simpler mechanic, and a lot of times it can lead to really cool moments. That being said, as a Dungeon Master, flanking does provide its headaches. One of the things that frustrates me most about flanking is that if you stick to the rules as written, really only the 2 creatures on opposing sides of the monkey in the middle get advantage on their attack rolls. Especially if you have a DM whose monsters are also taking advantage of this feature, a lot of times you end up with this weird checkerboard effect on the grid. This positioning doesn't really make any sense from a fighting perspective, and it's hard for a DM to narratively justify why this opposite end flanking would be a better tactic than, say, just ganging up on a single creature and killing it until it dies. Basically, I implement something called gang up flanking. This means as long as 2 creatures are satisfying the flanking condition, any other hostile creature that comes into the monkey in the middle also has advantage on their melee attack rolls. Now, I could already hear some DMs protesting that this might break 5th edition's combat, so let me explain. Not only does this make the board make more sense, there is a new different risk-reward that the players have to go through when they decide to gang up flank. Anytime you have creatures surround a single target, they're now positioning themselves for AoE spells, harmful auras, and traps that creature in the middle might have set up. Just imagine, your entire party of 4 characters all gangs up on a single target that is there only to drop a bead of fireball that then engulfs everybody because they've all closed in on a single target. So yes, they get the reward of getting advantage on all their melee attacks, but now they're also risking positioning themselves for an AoE. The other thing I do with flanking is I do allow 3D flanking, meaning if you have a hovering creature right here and you have a player on the bottom and on the top of it, both those players also get advantage. And like I said, enemies can also use this tactic as well, which is really the balance point to flanking. So Homebrew rule number 4 is really the only one that I use that works against the player. This one is stricter inventory management. Now, especially with a tabletop RPG, I've never found a really good reason to hand-wave inventory management, and I even find certain rules like variant encumbrance a little problematic. In my inventory system, an item's volume as well as its weight is taken into account when determining how much a character can carry. If we just use variant encumbrance, a barbarian with a high enough strength score can reasonably carry 10 greatswords, which in any world doesn't really make sense. Now, this doesn't mean I track every little potion that every character carries, and the only thing I do really hand-wave is carrying currency. But it does mean that when it comes to looting a room or, figuring out which items to take into a dungeon, the party does have to pay attention to what they're carrying and whether or not it's going to hamper them in combat. Also, as a subsection of this rule, I make it so a character can't carry more than 20 pieces of ammunition at a time. This means if the party buys or finds magical ammunition, they do have to leave mundane ammunition behind. In addition, I always found the break rate in the core rules kinda high for ammunition. If we stick to the rules as written, a ranged character only gets half of their ammunition back at the end of an encounter. Instead, it does require a little bit more management, but I have ranged characters roll a d10, and only on a 1 or a 2 does their ammunition break. Magical ammunition, though, always breaks as soon as they use it. The other way they can break their ammo is if they roll a nat 1 on an attack roll. I just consider the ammunition broken. This is the only rule I really revise in the core rules, and it does make it a little bit more tedious to play a ranged character that's dependent on ammunition. However, I do find this helps with a character's immersion and accountability, and it really gets them to think through the value of their choices during the character building process. And last but not least, Homebrew rule number 5. Homebrew rule number 5 is the called shot threshold. Now, there are many different tabletop systems that use a called shot mechanic, where by taking a penalty to an attack roll, a player can target something a little more specific than the rules usually handle. Usually, the numerical penalty to the attack roll is offset by the circumstantial reward the player receives by hitting a specific target. For example, if you have a character that's aiming specifically for a dragon's wing, they may take a -4 penalty. However, if they hit the wing, that may reduce the dragon's fly speed. Now, I found that with my players at my table, if I introduce an option where there's a penalty for a reward, they're less likely to take it. However, if I offer the same option as a bonus to the target's armor class, my players tend to be more likely to take that option. For example, whether or not I offer a -4 penalty to their attack roll or a +4 bonus to the armor class they need to hit, the math ends up working out the same, but the perception of the math for my players is a little bit different. Using that information, I created what's called the called shot threshold. What this means is if a player attempts to target a specific limb or a specific target on an enemy creature, then that creature gets a +5 bonus to its armor class. However, if the player's attack still meets their regular armor class, but not the new threshold, they still deal their damage as normal. If they also meet the threshold, then there's some kind of circumstantial bonus that they get, and the target is usually debuffed. So for example, let's go back to the dragon example. Let's say that a dragon has an armor class of 18. And a character is attempting to shoot at one of the dragon's wings. If the character rolls a 19, they just roll damage as normal, they hit the broadside of the dragon. If they roll a 23, however, now they've hit the dragon's wing, and the dragon's speed is reduced probably by 10. What this does is it removes the punishment a player might have for trying something creative or getting more immersed in their role-playing. However, it also rewards them if they roll really, really well. The other reason why I chose 5 as the called shot threshold is if you look at the core rules, when passive scores are handled, if a passive score were to have advantage, then the passive score is increased by 5. If the players are attempting to shoot something very difficult, like say the dragon's eye, I may offer the dragon a +10 bonus to its armor class. However, if they roll natural 20, they still get rewarded with a really cool effect. So these are the 5 homebrew rules that I implement in my Dungeons & Dragons games. And remember, each subscription means the world to us, and it lets us keep sharing our world with you. And that's all for today, everybody. Have an awesome day, and remember, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.